Do you have any strange bedtime rituals? Perhaps you like to sleep with a teddy bear? Or maybe you must have your phone by your side in case of an emergency. Well, whatever your nighttime habits may be, they're probably not as weird as those of the ancient Egyptians. They believed that at night, the realm of the living and the realm of the dead would merge, and that dangerous spirits could come through from the underworld and attack unsuspecting sleepers. So if you wanted to avoid being possessed by one of these demons while you slept, you had to go through some very unusual steps to protect yourself. And it wasn't just pharaohs who were targeted by evil spirits either. It was every Egyptian male over the age of 25. That's right, even the mightiest pharaohs didn't escape this disturbing ritual until they reached their mid-30s. But before we reveal what these men had to do every night to avoid demonic possession, let's take a moment to explain why they were so worried about such things in the first place. You see, ancient Egypt was a society obsessed with death. And no wonder, considering that every single pharaoh they had ever known was dead and mummified. In fact, death played a central role in every Egyptian's life, as they believed that the afterlife was just as important, if not more important, than life itself. So much so, in fact, that when an Egyptian died, they would prepare their body for an eternity of existence by removing its organs and preserving it with spices and cloth. Then they would bury the body with all of their favorite possessions, including food, drink, jewelry, and even chariots. And then they would build an elaborate tomb over the burial chamber so that the deceased could rest in peace, or at least they tried to. As the ancient Egyptians saw it, the afterlife was just another adventure that the soul had to endure. And just like in life, there were dangers lurking around every corner. One of the greatest fears of the ancient Egyptians was that their newly departed souls would get lost in the desert of the afterlife and never find their way to the field of reeds, a kind of Egyptian heaven. But even if they did make it to the field of reeds, they might not be able to stay there forever. That's because the ancient Egyptians believed that the god Osiris, who ruled the underworld, had a nasty habit of kicking people out of his realm and sending them back to the world of the living. Apparently, he didn't like it when mortals got too comfortable in his domain. And even though being sent back to Earth wasn't exactly a punishment, it was still pretty embarrassing for the Egyptians. After all, it meant that they weren't ready to move on to the afterlife and were still clinging to the world of the living. And if they were caught in between the two realms, they risked becoming what the Egyptians called a ghost, a soulless creature that fed on the life energy of its former family members. So it's not surprising that the ancient Egyptians went to great lengths to prevent their souls from being prematurely returned to their bodies. And that brings us back to those strange nighttime rituals. You see, the ancient Egyptians believed that the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead was at its thinnest at night. And that meant that malevolent spirits could cross over and do all sorts of evil things. For example, the ancient Egyptians believed that demons could enter their bodies and drive them insane. That's why you'll often hear stories about pharaohs going crazy towards the end of their lives, or the demons could cause physical ailments like blindness and paralysis, or worst of all, they could raise the dead. Yes, ancient Egyptian culture was so obsessed with death that they even had demons dedicated to raising the dead, and that's not something you want to mess around with. So if you were a male Egyptian over the age of 25, you had to perform a number of bizarre rituals to keep these evil spirits away. First, you had to wait until your wife had fallen asleep. This was because the ancient Egyptians believed that demons only targeted men whose wives were present in the bedroom with them. So once your wife was fast asleep, you could carry out your nightly routine without any fear of demonic interference. Second, you had to wash your hands and feet thoroughly. This was to remove any dirt or impurities that might attract evil spirits. You also needed to make sure that your fingernails and hair were clean and well-groomed, as these could also serve as entry points for demons. After cleansing yourself, you had to anoint your body with special oils and ointments. These substances were often made from plants and animals that were sacred to the Egyptians, such as frankincense, myrrh, and crocodile fat. Not only did these unguents smell nice and ward off evil spirits, but they also helped to preserve the body during the mummification process. Finally, you had to cover yourself with amulets and charms that could protect you from demonic possession. These objects were usually made from materials such as wood, stone, and leather, and they were inscribed with powerful spells and hieroglyphics. Some common symbols used on these amulets included the Eye of Horus, which symbolized protection and healing, and the scarab beetle, which represented rebirth and transformation. And that wasn't all you had to do to avoid demonic possession. As soon as you finished anointing yourself with oil and covering yourself in amulets, you had to immediately lie down in bed and pretend to be asleep. That's right. You couldn't even go to sleep normally because demons could sense your breathing and heart rate and determine whether or not you were actually awake. So to throw them off, you had to lie perfectly still until dawn, no matter how uncomfortable you were. And if you were really paranoid, you would even cover yourself with mosquito netting so that demons couldn't sneak up on you. But there was one part of this ritual that was even weirder than all the others, and it involved using human excrement to repel evil spirits. That's right. The ancient Egyptians believed that demons hated nothing more than the smell of human poop, so they would often smear some on their walls and floors. They also kept piles of it near their beds and even put some in bags around their necks. Now, I know that sounds absolutely disgusting, but it was actually considered quite pleasant by ancient Egyptian standards. You see, in addition to being repelled by the smell of feces, the ancient Egyptians also believed that demons were unable to cross doorways or thresholds of any kind. So in order to protect themselves, they would place piles of poop at the entrances to their homes and even inside their bedrooms. This practice was especially common in the homes of pharaohs and other wealthy Egyptians, as they were seen as being more vulnerable to demonic attacks than commoners. But it wasn't just the threshold theory that led the Egyptians to use human excrement as a form of protection. They also believed that demons were unable to stand the sight of blood. So in addition to covering themselves in feces, they would also cut themselves and let their blood drip onto the ground. If you think about it, that's a pretty smart strategy. Demons are often depicted as being repelled by blood in many different cultures, and the Egyptians were simply taking that folklore and turning it into a practical application. By covering their thresholds with blood and poop, they were creating a barrier that demons would be hard-pressed to cross. Of course, this didn't always work. There were plenty of times when demons managed to get past the Egyptians' defenses and possess their bodies. But the rituals did make it more difficult for them to do so, and that was all the ancient Egyptians could ask for. Now check out Insane Egyptian Mummies, Real Life, or click this other video instead.